The night was a flat, featureless void until the Napoleon solo slammed into something immense. The impact did not sound like wood hitting timber. It was a dull, bone-jarring thud that vibrated through the deck plates and straight into Steven Callahan's teeth. He was thrown against the bulkhead, the world tilting at a sickening angle before the boat groaned in protest. Metal shrieked. The hull shuddered violently, a long, agonizing tear that silenced the hum of the engine.
Then came the sound that cut through the confusion, the rhythmic,
aggressive rush of water pouring into the dark belly of the boat. Steven scrambled to his feet, but the floor already felt wrong, unstable, sluggish, and heavy. He reached for the handrail, but it was slick with spray. The boat dipped, the stern lifting as the bow began its descent into the abyss.
He looked down into the cabin, seeing the black water rising to meet the threshold.
The collision had not just damaged the vessel, it had claimed it. There was no time to process the shock. No time to look for a cause. The Napoleon solo was dying, and he was the only thing left on board. Steven dove into the dark cabin. Water surged around his waist, cold and heavy with debris. He grabbed the emergency pack, wedged the spear gun under his arm, and kicked toward the surface. The boat groaned, a deep structural scream that echoed off the water. He hauled the supplies onto the small raft, his knuckles white against the rubber. As he shoved off, the boat dipped vertically, the stern rising like a tombstone before sliding beneath the surface. A whirlpool pulled at the raft, spinning him in a dizzying arc. He braced himself, digging his heels into the base, fighting to keep the vessel upright as the last of the boat's air escaped in a long,
bubbling hiss. Then, the surface leveled out. The violent splashing ceased. The chaotic groans of shifting metal died away. Steven stopped moving. He sat in the center of the raft, chest heaving, listening. There was no wind, no engine hum, no rhythmic slap of waves against a hull. Only the sound of his own pulse, ringing in his ears, and the absolute terrifying stillness of an ocean that had claimed his world. The darkness was not empty. It was pressurized, heavy, and absolute. Steven sat perfectly still.
His eyes locked on the faint, rhythmic movement of the horizon against the stars. Every time the raft pitched, the plastic groaned. It was a sharp, biting sound like a twig snapping or a seal failing. Each pop sent a jolt through his nerves. He reached out, pressing his palms into the rubber floor, searching for moisture.
For a leak, for the telltale hiss of escaping air. There was nothing, just the sound of the material settling.
He let his breath out in a slow, jagged stream, but the relief lasted only seconds. The raft shifted again. A dull thud echoed beneath him, as if something solid had bumped the floor from below. He froze, his muscles locking tight, his heart beat a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. He waited for the prod to rush in, for the floor to go soft, for the sea to reclaim his only sanctuary. The sound did not repeat. The ocean remained silent, hiding its intent. He kept his hands on the emergency gear, his knuckles aching from the pressure. Sleep was a risk he could not afford. The night became a long,
agonizing test of his grip on reality, where every creak of the raft was a reminder that he was adrift in a void.
The sky began to pale, shedding the protective cover of night to reveal an unforgiving reality. Steven squinted into the distance. The horizon was not a line, but a flat, metallic sheet of water that stretched into infinity, reflecting the morning light with a blinding, sterile glare. He rotated his body slowly, scanning the 360-degree expanse for a sail, a plume of smoke, or the silhouette of a ship. There was only the vast, rhythmic heave of the ocean. The air began to warm, the temperature climbing with a sudden, oppressive speed. Within hours, the moisture in his mouth evaporated. His tongue felt thick, a dry weight against his teeth. He licked his lips, but the salt crusting on his skin only made the sensation worse.
The thirst was not a distant concern. It was an active, gnawing pressure in his throat.
He looked down at the empty floor of the raft, then back at the sun climbing steadily toward its zenith. The reality of his vulnerability settled in, colder than the night air had been. He was a speck of rubber on a desert of salt, and his body had already begun to demand the one thing he did not have. He reached for his supplies, his movements sluggish and deliberate, trying to conserve the energy he would need to survive the coming heat. The solar stills sat in the center of the raft, small plastic domes that promised the only path to survival. Steven reached for them, but his hands betrayed him. They shook with a violent, involuntary tremor that made his fingers clumsy and stiff. He gripped the edges of the stills, his knuckles white,
fighting to keep the seals tight. The plastic felt hot, slick with salt, and fragile under his touch. One wrong move, one tear in the material, and he would lose the condensation he so desperately needed. He paused,
his chest heaving, forcing his breathing to slow until the shaking subsided just enough to set the stills properly. He arranged them to catch the direct glare of the sun. Then, he sat back, his eyes fixed on the clear basins. Every minute felt like an hour. He watched for the first bead of moisture to form, his throat tight
and constricted. The line between life and death was no longer measured in miles or days.
But in the slow, agonizing drip of water into the plastic collection bags, he did not look away. He could not afford to. The ocean around him was a vast source of salt, and his survival now depended entirely on the slow, mechanical process of turning that poison into a single, life-sustaining drop. The wait for water was torture, so he replaced the silence with motion. Steven stood up, his legs stiff, and began a systematic inspection of the raft. He crawled along the perimeter, fingers tracing every seam, every patch of rubber, feeling for the soft give of a slow leak. He found a hairline fracture near the stern where the salt had begun to crystallize and abrade the material. He did not panic. He simply reached for the repair kit, cleaned the area with a rag, and applied the sealant with slow, surgical precision. The act of fixing it, of asserting order over the chaos of the sea, gave him a fragile sense of purchase. Once the seal was set, he moved to the next task. He scanned the horizon, a slow, methodical sweep from left to right, then back again. He checked the lashings on his gear, ensuring nothing was loose, nothing was prone to drifting away. He broke his existence into small, bite-sized cycles. Inspect, repair, scan, repeat. If he could manage the raft, he could manage the next hour. If he could manage the hour, he could manage the day. It was a mechanical, cold approach, but it kept the encroaching fog of hopelessness at bay. He was no longer just drifting, he was working.
The routine kept his mind steady, but it could not stop the hollow, gnawing ache in his stomach. Hunger arrived with a sharp,
insistent bite that made his core feel as if it were collapsing inward. He turned his attention to the water beneath the raft. A shadow darted past, lean and fast. Steven grabbed the spear gun, his grip tight, his muscles coiled for a strike. The fish circled back, hovering just inches below the surface. He lunged.
The spear tip sliced through the water, but the fish was already gone, leaving only a ripple in his wake.
He pulled the weapon back, his chest heaving, sweat stinging his eyes. The sun beat down with relentless intensity, turning the surface of the sea into a blinding mirror. He tried again, bracing his feet against the rubber, watching the water with predatory focus. Another shadow appeared. He fired, but the spear grazed nothing but open space. The frustration was a physical weight, heavier than the thirst. He missed a third time, then a fourth.
His hands began to tremble with the exertion, and the salt-crusted surface of the raft felt like a furnace beneath him. He was burning under the glare, his skin tightening and cracking, yet the ocean refused to yield a single meal. Every failure tightened the knot in his throat, leaving him gasping for air in the oppressive, shimmering heat.
He stopped lunging. The frantic energy of the last few hours had only served to drive the prey away.
Steven leaned over the edge, his breath controlled, his body perfectly still against the gentle heave of the raft.
He waited for the refraction to settle. A silver shape drifted into view, hovering just below the surface. He did not aim for the fish. He aimed for the distorted space below it. He released the trigger with a sharp, metallic click. The spear blurred, sinking true. There was a frantic thrash against the rubber, a spray of seawater, and then the weight of the catch. He pulled the line taut, hauling the fish onto the floor of the raft. It was slick, cold,
and still struggling. He did not wait for a fire he could not build. He used his knife to slice a strip of flesh.
The blade dull but functional. He shoved the meat into his mouth, chewing hard to break the tough, fibrous texture. His stomach rebelled, a wave of nausea rolling through him, but he forced himself to swallow. It was raw, metallic, and tasted of salt, yet it was life. He consumed the rest in hurried, desperate bites, ignoring the revulsion. The hunger did not vanish, but the hollow ache in his chest receded. He wiped his hands on the raft, stared at the horizon, and felt a cold, primal shift in his resolve. He was no longer just waiting to die. He was feeding the machine. The scent of the kill lingered, a dark invitation staining the clear water. Steven washed the remaining scales from his palms.
But the iron tang of blood remained trapped in the creases of his skin. He leaned back,
the adrenaline of the hunt fading into a heavy, leaden exhaustion. Then, the water changed. A long, gray shape emerged from the depths, moving with a terrifying liquid grace. A dorsal fin sliced the surface, cutting a clean line through the mirrored horizon. Then a second appeared, circling in the opposite direction.
Steven froze. He pulled his legs onto the center of the raft, his knees pressed against his chest,
trying to minimize his profile. The sharks were not attacking, but they were watching. Every time the raft bobbed against the swell, the fins drew closer, their rhythm hypnotic and predatory. He watched the water, his pulse thrumming in his throat, realizing that the ocean had not just provided a meal, it had invited his hunters. Each pass of the fins was a calculated reminder of his fragility. A silent countdown played out in the blue.
He held his breath, his eyes locked on the water, refusing to move a muscle. He was no longer the hunter, he was the bait.
And the sea was closing in with a patient, rhythmic cruelty that stripped away his sense of safety. The sharks remained, but their presence began to blur into the background hum of the sea. Steven stared at the horizon until the light distorted his vision. The clouds shifted, forming rigid, geometric shapes that looked like ship hulls and white sails. He squinted, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was certain he saw a mast. He stood, wobbling on the unstable rubber, and cupped his hands to call out. The only response was the slap of water against the raft. Silence returned, heavy and thick. Then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic calling of his name, rising from the crest of a swell. It was his father, clear and insistent. Steven spun around, scanning the empty expanse of blue. There was nothing but the sun and the shifting water. He sat back down, his hands trembling as he gripped the side of the raft. The voice returned, softer this time, blending with the sound of the wind. He knew it was impossible, yet he found himself answering, whispering back into the void. His mind was drifting, untethered from the physical world. He focused on his own breathing to ground himself, but the illusion persisted. The sea was no longer just salt and hunger. It was a theater of ghosts. He stared into the waves, unable to distinguish the truth from the static of his own exhaustion.
The phantom voices faded, replaced by a sound that was far more dangerous. It was a soft, rhythmic hiss.
Barely audible over the slap of the tide, Steven shifted his weight, and the floor of the raft gave way beneath him with a sickening, spongy resistance. He froze. He looked down at the main air valve at his feet. A tiny, steady stream of bubbles was escaping into the water. The rubber near the seam was buckling, losing the rigid shape that had kept him afloat for weeks. He pressed his thumb against the valve, trying to seal the leak, but the air hissed harder, mocking his grip. The raft was losing its buoyancy. The edge of the craft dipped lower, allowing a thin layer of salt water to lap over the rim and soak his legs. He scrambled to the center, trying to distribute his weight, but the sagging floor made it impossible to stay steady. Panic flared in his chest, sharp and cold, but he shoved it down. He grabbed the pump, his knuckles white, and stared at the valve. The ocean was no longer just a vast, empty space. It was an active force trying to reclaim the space he occupied. He had to stop the air from leaving, or he would be submerged before the sun set. He tightened his jaw, ready to fight the rubber and the sea. Steven jammed the pump nozzle into the valve and began the work. Down, up, down, up. The hiss of escaping air fought him with every stroke. He ignored the burning in his shoulders and fixed his eyes on the drooping seam of the raft.
His fingers, softened by weeks of immersion, caught on the sharp edges of the plastic pump handle.
A thin line of crimson bloomed across his palm, mixing with the salt and grime. But he did not stop. He could not. Every time his grip slipped, he readjusted, his knuckles raw and white against the dark material. The rhythm became his pulse. He counted the strokes, forcing his mind away from the endless horizon and onto the simple, mechanical movement of the pump. 100 strokes. The raft regained a fraction of its tension. 200. The hiss grew faint, then returned as the valve struggled to hold.
He felt the skin on his fingertips tearing, the friction turning the plastic handle slick with his own blood.
He wiped his hand on his leg, braced his feet against the floor, and pulled again. There was no room for anything but the next motion. His muscles screamed, but he locked his elbows, driving the plunger down with every ounce of remaining weight. The raft held. For now, it held. The rhythm broke. Steven slumped forward, the pump handle slipping from his blood-slicked grip and clattering against the floor. His arms felt like lead weights, unresponsive and heavy, dragging his shoulders toward the salt-crusted rubber. A wave hit the side of the raft, and the impact sent a jolt of pain through his spine. Yet he could not find the strength to brace himself. He blinked, but the horizon refused to sharpen. The world smeared into a hazy, vibrating gray. His vision pulsed with every erratic beat of his heart. He reached out to grab the pump again, but his fingers refused to curl. They remained splayed and stiff, useless instruments against the smooth, mocking surface of the plastic.
The silence of the ocean felt heavy, pressing down on him, amplifying the ragged, shallow sound of his own breathing.
He tried to lift his head, but his neck muscles felt like frayed rope. Every movement he attempted resulted in a tremor that shook his entire frame. He was no longer fighting the sea. He was fighting the biological refusal of his own body to continue. The raft dipped again, and he remained slumped, staring at the salt crystals blooming on the floor, waiting for the strength to return.
Steven closed his eyes, shutting out the shifting horizon that mocked his stillness.
The urge to drift into the silence was a physical weight, pulling him down into the water. He fought it by narrowing his world. 76 days meant nothing. The vast, empty ocean meant nothing. He focused on the salt crusting his eyelashes. One blink, he cleared the salt. Then, he focused on the sensation of his own heartbeat against the floor. One pulse. He forced his hand to twitch, then to flex. He made a deal with himself. He would not consider the next hour, only the next movement. He reached for the water container. His fingers brushed the plastic, and he gripped it with a sudden, sharp intent. one sip. He measured the liquid in his mouth before swallowing. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely under his control. He scanned the raft, identifying a loose tie-down strap. He ignored the burning in his limbs and reached for the knot. His fingers worked the plastic rope, fighting the stiffness until the tension held. He did not look at the sun. He did not look at the sharks. He looked at the knot. He had one task finished. He set his mind on the next, anchoring his sanity to the sequence of small, physical chores that kept the air in the raft and his heart beating. The panic that once governed his actions was gone, replaced by a cold, mechanical rhythm. Steven moved with the predictability of a clock. Every action became a pre-programmed sequence. He checked the raft seams for pressure leaks, his thumb tracing the rubber edges with surgical focus. He caught a flash of movement below, but he did not lung. He tracked the fish with his eyes until the angle was perfect, then released the spear with a steady, calculated twitch of his wrist. It was not about hunger anymore. It was about the task. When a valve jammed, his breath did not quicken. He did not curse the ocean or the equipment. He simply reached for his small, improvised tool, applied pressure to the exact point of resistance, and waited for the click of the seal seating correctly. His movements were efficient, wasting no energy, discarding all unnecessary motion. He observed the horizon not for rescue, but to gauge the shift in light for his daily chores. He had become an extension of the raft, a component designed for one purpose, to endure. He scrubbed the deck with a piece of abrasive shell, rhythmically clearing the salt until the surface shone. The sea remained vast and indifferent, but he had mastered the geometry of his own survival. His world had narrowed to a radius of 6 feet, defined by the thick, crusted salt that coated every surface. The air was heavy with the smell of drying brine and the sour, metallic tang of fish left too long in the sun. Steven shifted his weight, and the raft groaned beneath him, a sound that blended with the constant, rhythmic slap of waves against rubber. His skin was a map of white, cracked patches where salt had leached the moisture away. He reached into the small pile of scavenged catch. The flesh was soft, pungent, and slick with a film of decay. He pulled a piece apart with his fingers, the smell clinging to his skin like oil. He did not recoil. He consumed it with the same indifference he showed the rising tide. Sweat pooled in the hollows of his collarbone, hot and stinging, before the wind stripped it away,
leaving a fresh layer of crystals behind. Every breath carried the taste of the sea, sharp and abrasive. He looked down into the dark water,
watching the shifting shadows. He was no longer fighting the decay. He was submerged in it. The environment did not care if he lived or died, and he had stopped asking it for permission. He sat in the center of the rot, his pulse steady, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the next cycle to begin. The ocean stopped feeling like a cage and began to feel like a living map. Steven watched the water move, no longer seeing it as a chaotic force, but as a series of interconnected pulses. He noticed the way the raft drifted, not aimlessly, but caught in the invisible drag of a deeper current. He leaned over the edge, trailing his hand in the brine, feeling the temperature shift where two streams converged. This was the rhythm he had been missing. He adjusted the raft's anchor, not to fight the drift, but to align with it. The water beneath him changed from a deep, threatening black to a lighter, translucent blue, signaling a shift in the sea floor far below. He stopped bracing his muscles against the swell, and instead let his body sway with the motion, matching the oscillation of the waves. The constant, aggressive need to struggle evaporated. He was no longer a stranger trespassing on the surface. He was a part of the water's flow. He watched a cluster of seaweed pass by, recognizing the specific direction of the tide by its angle. Every ripple now carried information. He closed his eyes and felt the lift and drop of the raft, now perfectly synced with the deep, slow breathing of the sea. He had ceased to be a victim of the tide and had begun, in every sense, to inhabit it. The sky began to speak in a frequency he finally understood. A flock of terns broke the silence, their calls no longer just sharp, discordant sounds, but precise directional markers. Steven watched them dive, noting the exact angle of their descent into the swell. He realized the birds were not just hunting, they were mapping the convergence of currents he had spent weeks studying. He leaned forward, his focus absolute. When a frigate bird banked hard to the west, he knew the change in the wind before he felt it on his skin. He stopped scanning the horizon for rescue and started reading the water for truth. The ocean was a vast, complex language of pressure, temperature, and flight. He traced the patterns in his mind, linking the movement of the clouds to the drift of the sea. There was a profound clarity in this connection. He was no longer a man waiting for an end. He was a component of the ecosystem, operating with the same mechanical efficiency as the tide. He adjusted his position, not by choice, but by instinct, moving exactly as the current demanded. He had transcended the threshold of endurance. The sea was no longer an adversary to be survived, but a home he had learned to navigate. His survival was absolute, locked in the rhythm of the waves and the flight of the birds. The rhythm of the ocean was interrupted by a low, mechanical thrum that did not belong to the wind or the waves. Stephen lifted his head, his eyes struggling to focus against the glare of the morning sun. He scanned the horizon. The sound grew, vibrating through the floor of the raft. Then he saw it, a dark, angular shape emerging from the haze near the coast of Marie Galante. It was a fishing boat. He watched the white wake trailing behind the vessel, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way he had not felt for months. The boat cut through the water, closing the distance. He stood up, his legs shaking violently, and raised his arms. He shouted, but his voice was a dry, raspy ghost of a sound. He tried again, waving his limbs with every ounce of remaining strength. The boat did not turn away. It slowed, the engine dropping to a low idle as the boat cut through the swells toward him. A figure on the deck pointed in his direction. The absolute stillness of his 76 days shattered. He collapsed back onto the rubber surface, his vision blurring as the reality of human presence washed over him. The boat loomed closer, growing from a speck into a massive, tangible salvation. He was no longer alone. The hands that reached for him were calloused and firm. They hauled him over the gunwale, his body collapsing onto the wooden deck of the fishing boat. The deck was hard, unyielding, and stable a sensation. His brain struggled to reconcile after nearly 3 months of constant, rhythmic motion. He lay there, gasping, feeling the vibration of the engine beneath his chest. The crew moved around him, their voices a blur of unfamiliar, rapid speech. He could not process the words, only the intent behind them. They covered him, shielding him from the sun that had defined his existence for 76 days. When the boat finally bumped against the pilings of the dock at Marie Galante, the impact sent a jolt through his frame. He was helped toward the edge, his legs trembling as he stood upright. He reached out, steadying himself against a metal cleat. He took the first step, his boot making contact with the weathered wood of the dock. He took another. The ground did not sway. It did not rise to meet a wave. It did not tilt. He stood still, feeling the absolute, unmoving weight of the earth beneath his feet. The struggle was over. He was no longer drifting. He had arrived.